Hello, folks. Tonight we're diving into the hidden world behind monastery walls, where virtue and chastity get preached, but aren't exactly front and center in practice. Because while the Middle Ages gave us huge cathedrals and sacred manuscripts, they also left behind court records, confessions, and letters revealing a much less saintly side of medieval nuns, including secret lovers, hidden pregnancies, escape tunnels, and even wild parties hidden behind a veil of spiritual ecstasy. So, before you get too comfy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely dig what I'm doing here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fun to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim those lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some soothing white noise. And let's start tonight's journey together. When a woman entered a medieval convent, she was expected to leave the outside world behind, along with her clothes, jewelry, and last name. She also gave up any right to physical affection. In theory, she became the bride of Christ. In reality, this marriage had plenty of loopholes. The vow of chastity was serious business, no touching, no flirting, and definitely no midnight meetups in the garden with Brother Thomas down the hill. But as any good historian or headache-ridden bishop will tell you, a vow only sticks if you actually mean it. And in many convents, wills were pretty flexible. For some nuns, chastity was more of a polite suggestion. After all, if you're locked behind stone walls for decades, surrounded by nothing but other women, and occasionally a suspiciously handsome confessor, things can get blurry, real blurry. Some got creative. Rumor had it that feelings didn't count if you weren't intentional about them. Others exploited spiritual loopholes. If Christ is your heavenly hubby, who's going to argue with a little passion, even if it's mystical or not? Especially if you write it in Latin. Reports from church officials checking if everything was pure and pious often contained politely worded complaints like excessive intimacy between the sisters or unaccompanied male visitors wandering the orchard, which basically meant someone was misbehaving, probably near the apples. Then there were convents that were basically aristocratic dorms. Wealthy families sent their troublesome daughters with the clear hope that someone else would handle their enthusiasm. Some convents tried, others shrugged and hoped the bishop didn't visit too often. Of course, not all nuns went rogue. Many led genuinely devout lives, praying, studying, and baking bread so much they could dent helmets. But others, let's just say, they interpreted the rules on chastity like people today interpret all-you-can-eat buffets. Yes, chastity was inked in vows, sworn before God, and stitched into rules, but behind those quiet walls. Sometimes the story got rewritten. Generally, pregnancy was hard to explain, especially if you were a nun, while you could hide a secret lover or smuggle a contraband wheel of cheese. Hiding a growing belly under a habit was way trickier and even trickier to explain without dragging in at least one person, a ton of sins, and maybe a confused donkey. Medieval convents were supposed to be sanctuaries of purity, but reality had other ideas. Church records, bishops' complaints, and actual criticism from Monks all showed a consistent truth: nuns were getting pregnant, not hypothetically, not symbolically, not spiritually, undeniably, and inconveniently pregnant. Excuses. They were usually pretty creative. Some folks swore they were possessed by demons. Others claimed miraculous conceptions, technically possible. If you trust the Bible but totally suspicious when it happened in 3 towns over and involved Jacques, the choir director, one nun even insisted she fell into a man. Gravity's a tough argument to beat. Once caught, monasteries usually freaked out and forgot all about strategy. Pregnant nuns would be sent off for retreats or suddenly fall ill, requiring full-on seclusion if she gave birth. The baby might be sneaked out at night to an orphanage, a sympathetic relative, or in worse cases, nowhere at all. Some infants quietly got buried right on monastery grounds with vague apology tombstones to God. The father, that was always the next question, and the answers varied wildly: priests, traveling nobles, gardeners. In one memorable trial, the accused was A. The next question and answer combos were all over the place: priests, traveling nobles, gardeners. In one memorable trial, the accused was a wandering harp player with a cheeky grin. No explanations needed or given. Punishments all over the map. Nuns from peasant backgrounds could be kicked out in disgrace, but those born noble, they got stern warnings and much softer penalties. One particularly shameless abbess was caught with a lover and a kid, but kept her job, clearly. Management back then had some serious favoritism going on. Of course, the church insisted these were just rare, tragic, and totally regrettable incidents. But archives tell a different story. Parchment never lies, especially when scandals involved. If medieval monasteries underestimated one thing, it was the power of office supplies. Love in the convent was a subtle, silent affair, coded and written in fancy Latin, maybe a romantic confession or a heartfelt prayer. Nuns might vow silence, but their quills not so obedient. Letters were everything. When face-to-face meetings got too risky and meaningful glances across the chapel fell short, love found its loophole through ink and wax seals. Some slipped through cracks in nearby walls. Others got stuffed into loaves of bread or passed via suspiciously useful newbies with completely blank faces. The content could be sweet or downright unprintable. One nun wrote to her priest lover, confessing she longed to drink from his holy chalice. The bishop, investigating, freaked out so much he ordered the letter burned twice just to be sure. Those secret love affairs weren't always brief flings. Some lasted years. A nun in France maintained a correspondence with a young noble for over a decade, outliving 2 abbesses and dodging at least 3 attempts to catch her. She was finally busted after quoting Ovid way too accurately in the choir book. Naturally, the church was less than thrilled about this literary passion. When these letters were discovered, punishments followed: excommunication, penance, solitary prayer confinement, or worse, forced public reading before the whole convent, which could be even more humiliating than God's judgment. As for the lovers, if they were clergy, they often got reassigned to a cold, Less romantic post. If they were lay people, they faced beatings, fines, and orders never to talk to women in the church or anyone else. Really? His response, "Can I at least keep writing?" Even more embarrassing were the love letters intercepted and spread like medieval gossip columns. Imagine spending hours pouring out your deepest, most sacred feelings only to have them read aloud by a giggling apprentice clutching cheese right beside me. Yet the ink kept flowing, because when high walls and watchful eyes are everywhere, love turns into metaphor, hints, and determined handwriting. In theory, monasteries were fortresses of purity. In reality, they were more like walled boarding schools, sometimes with surprisingly many escape routes. Medieval nuns weren't just spiritually restless. Some got pretty creative physically, and if you're picturing gentle, pretty girls gliding, love letters got intercepted and passed around like medieval gossip columns. Imagine spending hours pouring your heart out, only to have your deepest, most sacred feelings read aloud by a giggling newbie standing next to me and a chunk of cheese. Still, the ink kept flowing when you're surrounded by high walls and prying eyes. Love gets coded in metaphors, hints, and some seriously determined handwriting. In theory, the monastery was a fortress of purity. In reality, it was more like a boarding school with walls and sometimes surprisingly many escape routes. Medieval nuns weren't just spiritually restless, some got physically creative. And if you're picturing delicate ladies tiptoeing through rose gardens, think again. Some escape attempts involved climbing walls with bed sheets, bribing guards, crawling through sewers, and once, even disguising as a monk to stroll out the front door like it was just another Tuesday. Motives varied. Some fled to reunite with lovers. Others just hated convent life. Some simply realized eternal silence means exactly that. Even in probably the most legendary runaway was Sister Benedetta from Verona. She was locked up at 14 and made 3 escape attempts. On the 3rd try, she dressed up as a newbie nun from a nearby convent, faked travel papers, and escaped in a vegetable cart. Rumor has it she got halfway to Venice before getting caught, not because of the disguise, nope, but because she couldn't stop flirting with the guard. Some escapes got even more dramatic. In Saxony, a bunch of nuns staged a group breakout after hearing their abbess's band play. They used an old loaf of bread to knock out the gatekeeper and vanished into the woods. Church officials later called them lost souls with no remorse. Honestly, sounds like a tagline for a killer medieval play. When caught, runaway nuns were dragged back, publicly shamed, starved, and locked in a freezing stone cell with only a crucifix and their own regrets. Repeat offenders, there were plenty got transferred to stricter convents, with worse food and taller walls. But for some, even that wasn't enough to kill the rebellious spark. A few nuns escaped, got hitched to their lovers, and lived out their days acting like they'd never even seen a convent, let alone lived in one. Because sometimes routines just don't fit, and hey, windows were open. Every scandal has its icon. And in the convent hall of shame, Sister Agnes of Würzburg deserves her own stained glass window, preferably red-faced, according to all reports. Agnes was a clever and charming nun with a special knack for music, prayer, and hosting a party in her cell for over a year. Yep, a real knight in shining armor situation. Armor, swords, and probably some tragic backstory. His name got lost to history, which is suspicious in itself. What we do know is he was supposedly recovering from wounds in some battle, exactly where no one's sure. Could be a field, a tavern, or maybe the convent yard after a stumble trying to sneak in. According to the bishop's records, the knight was found after a novice reported strange clinking noises coming from Agnes's cell. Upon investigation, church officials found the guy hiding behind a tapestry, munching on pickled figs and humming hymns to pass the time. His only defense: Sister Agnes was a healer, both body and soul. The impressive part, Agnes didn't deny the relationship. In fact, she seemed genuinely annoyed at being disturbed. She claimed she was caring for the wounded, and compassion is a holy virtue true, though rarely the go-to excuse for living with a boyfriend wearing a chainmail necklace. The scandal shook the convent, not just because of what happened, but how long it went on. A few weeks, maybe even a secret tryst, might be forgivable, but 12 months, during which the knight was spotted at least twice wearing a borrowed monk's robe and helping with gardening that takes planning and commitment. The fallout was swift and dramatic. Agnes was stripped of her rank, publicly shamed, and transferred to a stricter order. The knight got fined and exiled, though one note says he showed no remorse, probably medieval talk for smiled the whole time. Later, Agnes penned a letter condemning the church's hypocrisy, quoting scripture and medical texts to defend herself. One line stands out: "If I let him die, I'd still be a sinner." Not every medieval convent scandal involved sneaky knights or secret love letters. Some nuns screamed louder, groaned, cried, and shook in front of crowds, all while claiming they were chatting with the divine, wearing borrowed robes and helping with gardening. That kind of plan took commitment. Consequences came fast and furious. Agnes was stripped of her position, publicly shamed, and transferred to a stricter order. The knight was fined and exiled, though one note says he showed no remorse, probably the medieval way of saying he smiled the whole time. As for Agnes, she later wrote letters blasting the church's hypocrisy, quoting scripture and medical texts in her defense. One line stood out: "If I let him die, I'm still a sinner." Not all medieval convent scandals involved sneaky knights or secret letters. Some nuns were way louder, moaning, crying, trembling in front of crowds while claiming to be chatting with the divine. Enter the mysterious nun. In the Middle Ages, some were famous for ecstatic religious visions. These weren't quiet moments of reflection. Nope. Full-on spiritual encounters, eyes rolled back, shaking on the floor. Some church officials called them saints, others raised eyebrows. The big question: why did these visions look so enthusiastic? Take Sister Beatrix, for example, a nun from the Low Countries, who swore Christ visited her every night, not metaphorically, literally. Her writings described the warm, holy embrace and a spiritual union that went way beyond the flesh curtain. At one point, she even claimed she'd married the Lamb of God, which sounds harmless until you read her comparing the Lamb's presence to a fire, spreading inside and out. Subtle. Then there's Hadowich of Antwerp, a 13th century mystic whose poems read like a medieval steamy romance novel if that novel was penned entirely inside a chapel. She wrote about drowning in love and being pierced by divine light. Some of her verses were so vivid, later church scholars tried to edit them into safer metaphors, but the original versions survived to shock and awe. Fair enough. Not every nun was faking ecstasy. Many were sincere. Medieval theology encouraged deep emotional bonds with Christ, sometimes slipping into language that modern readers might slap a PG-13 rating on. But sincerity didn't erase the fact that these images caused serious spiritual and other uproars. Not everyone was impressed. Some bishops accused these women of craving attention. Others worried about their influence on younger, more impressionable nuns. One particularly skeptical archbishop called it holiness in disguise, aka mass hysteria. Then he got transferred, probably for voicing what everyone else was thinking. Still, some mystical nuns became celebrities. Their visions were recorded, copied, and venerated. Medieval speak for getting away with writing religious fan fiction and calling it theology. If there was one thing medieval monasteries were famous for, it was self-control of the body, the tongue, and especially the stomach. Fasting was sacred. Hunger was a virtue. Appetite was the ultimate temptation. Best left outside with the snake. But inside some monasteries, fasting only happened during the day, because once the bells stopped and monks retreated to their cells, another ritual began the forbidden feast. Monasteries supposedly followed strict diets: porridge, bread, occasional fish, and an existential crisis for dessert: meat, rich cheese, sweets, and wine were usually banned, especially during Lent or any of the dozens of fasting days that made up half the year. But honestly, no one can eat boiled cabbage forever without plotting something. And plot they did. Some nuns developed secret foodie networks. Friendly merchants delivered salted meat for medical purposes. Wine got relabeled as holy vinegar. Honey cakes were reserved for visitors who never actually showed up. A surviving monastery inventory listed 2 ducks, a whole salted ham leg, a jug of cherry wine, and 3 cheese wheels, classified as medical supplies. Draw your own conclusions. Midnight feasts became a thing. Picture this: a candlelit room deep in the monastery, full of giggling nuns whispering hymns between bites of roast goose. A rookie was supposedly burned, grabbing a hot pastry out of the oven, trying to claim it was divine punishment from the Holy Spirit. No one bought that excuse, but the pastry was undeniably delicious. Sometimes these parties turned into social events with men, merchants, priests, or in some cases, guys with no official reason to be in the monastery after dark. A monastery in Burgundy got busted for hosting unauthorized gatherings, which were basically regular Saturday night parties, complete with dancing, cherry wine, and 3 cheese wedges. Classified as medical supplies. Draw your own conclusions. Midnight parties became a thing. Picture this: a candlelit room deep inside the monastery, full of nuns giggling, whispering hymns between bites of roast goose. A newbie supposedly burned her hand, sneaking hot pastries from the oven, and tried to claim it was the Holy Spirit's punishment. No one bought that excuse, but pastries, obviously, are awesome. Sometimes these parties turned into social events with guys, merchants, priests, or in some cases, random dudes who had no official reason to be in the monastery after dark. One monastery in Burgundy got caught throwing unauthorized get-togethers that were basically just regular Saturday night parties, dancing, gambling, and what the bishop tactfully called inappropriate performances. Of course, not every nun was involved. Plenty were devout and horrified by the indulgence. But others, let's just say their idea of fasting was eating as fast as possible before someone caught them. Few things freaked out medieval church officials more than a nun showing a baby bump, unless, of course, that bump turned into a baby and then a shallow grave right under the monastery's pantry. One of the creepiest scandals happened at a French convent in the 14th century, where rumors started about weird noises coming from the basement. Not rats. Plumbing wasn't bad either, according to a horrified newcomer. It was something crying that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. When church investigators showed up, they expected the usual liquor stash, some forbidden cheese, maybe a love letter or two. What they found was a hastily dug patch of earth beneath a barrel of sauerkraut. Underneath the body of a newborn wrapped in what was clearly a ragged cloth lay the headpiece of 2 nuns. The hint was about as subtle as a church bell at midnight. The investigation that followed was as subtle as a plague cart. The mother was never officially named, though some nuns got quietly transferred shortly after a polite way of saying, "Disappear quietly before this turns into a trial." When asked, the sisters all claimed ignorance. A's wasn't informed of any births, one said, standing next to a well-used wash basin. She added that any woman giving birth in the convent was obviously pregnant, which is one of the oldest and least convincing explanations in any scandal. This wasn't a one-off across Europe. Unwanted pregnancies sometimes ended tragically. Babies left at convent doors. Some were secretly placed with kind families. Sadly, some didn't live long enough. The church responded with its usual combo of outrage and selective amnesia. Punishments ranged from public penance to silent transfer, but as long as those walls stayed high and letters stayed hidden, stories like these stayed buried literally and figuratively. However, every time a basement got relaid or a pantry reorganized, there was a tiny chance of a new discovery, a little scandal wrapped in linen and silence, if there was a hierarchy of forbidden nun activities. Running a brothel probably ranked somewhere between heresy and chucking a bishop out a window, but in 15th century Bologna, an ex-nun named Sister Clara decided she was done with vows, veils, and virtue. So, she left the convent and opened a very successful brothel right in her old convent building, still using the same outfits, because subtlety clearly wasn't part of the business plan from the start. Clara Ara wasn't exactly convent material, Church records describe her as willfully and frequently absent from evening prayers, meaning she skipped prayers and probably had plans involving booze and a guy named Marco. Her decision to leave was no shock. She just walked out and never looked back. The real drama kicked in when passers-by noticed the convent suddenly became wildly popular with men who couldn't care less about theology, according to a local judge. Clara Ara recruited women, some former nuns, some just unemployed, running the place like a military operation. Clients reportedly paid extra for costumes. Some men even requested full confessions, which raised theological questions nobody wanted to answer. When the church caught wind, panic ensued, not because prostitution was rare, but because this brothel dared to look like a convent and somehow ran better than most actual convents. The optics were terrible when summoned to explain. Clara Ara just shrugged and said, "At least no one here's pretending to be persecuted." She got excommunicated, then excommunicated again to be sure. The building was seized, the operation shut down, and Clara Ara was supposedly sent to a convent far from Bologna, which sounds, she just shrugged and said, "At least no one here's pretending to be persecuted." She got excommunicated twice. Just to be sure, the building was seized, operations shut down, and Clara Ara was supposedly sent off to some monastery far from Bologna, which sounds weird. But hey, maybe poetic justice? Still, her legacy stuck around for years after. The place became known informally as the Monastery of Merriment. It even popped up in plays and songs, and despite the church's efforts to wipe her out, Clara Ara turned into a folk legend, the nun who ditched salvation for hospitality, confession the medieval Catholic spiritual reset button, for a nun that was basically the ultimate rebellion, a solemn ritual of self-questioning, humility, and repentance. You kneel, you whisper your sins, the priest grants absolution. In theory, you leave feeling lighter, but in reality, confession sometimes leads to more sins than forgiveness. Enter the confessional scandal, a screw-up so common it became a cliché. The setup's simple one priest, many nuns, and a private little space designed for whispering about temptation. What could possibly go wrong, turns out? Plenty. Some priests took their spiritual duties seriously. Others treated soul care as an open invitation to explore the emotional turf of the nuns, especially if they were young, anxious, or from rich families that offered some cover. Boundaries were thin, curtains thick, and the church's oversight mostly theoretical. In one infamous case, Father Anselm of Tours heard 30 nuns' confessions and somehow got spiritually cozy with 10 of them. The nuns started to suspect something fishy when Sister Magdalene came out of the confessional, giggling and smelling faintly of clove liquor. Reports of misconduct spread all over Europe. Some priests got caught meeting nuns at weird hours. Others received love letters disguised as theological questions. One was caught with his hand on a novice's knee, claiming he was checking for signs of demonic possession, at least creative. The church's reaction was a discreet silence, then transfers. A confessor accused of misconduct was usually sent to another diocese to reflect which in medieval speak meant, go do it somewhere else and try not to get caught this time. Meanwhile, the nuns were in a tough spot. Some were humiliated, others blamed outright, accused of seducing the priest with feminine wiles, which often just meant being under 30. A few refused to confess again, choosing silence over sanctity. Of course, not every confession turned scandalous, but the setup, male power, female submission, secret chats, it was basically an open invite for abuse, especially wrapped in incense and Latin prayers. Not all convent mischief was about flesh and desire. Some came in the form of suspiciously helpful nuns with access to plants that could cure headaches or end pregnancies. Almost every convent had an herb garden. It was just part of daily monastic life. Nuns made perfumes, drops, and herbal remedies for ailments from stomach aches to demonic possession, though success with the latter was a mixed bag. But in some communities, these humble healers became the convent pharmacists, and the line between medicine and mischief started to blur. They were called apothecary nuns, and sometimes knew their plants very well. Many were trained to use abortifacient herbs like mint, tansy, and rue, discreetly employed to restore irregular periods. Official explanations were always vague. The remedy was for nervous conditions or persistent arm bone imbalances, but everyone knew what it really meant when a nun visited the herb room with a flushed face and shaky voice. Some convents quietly gained reputations as safe havens for women with delicate problems. A noblewoman with a mysterious pregnancy might suddenly decide to go on retreat and reappear 2 months later, looking slimmer and way more devout. Sister Hildegard of Trier was particularly famous, noted as a discreet herbalist. According to a very worried male witness, her concoctions the following month, looking way slimmer and way more pious. Sister Hildegard of Trier was especially famous, recorded as a very discreet herbalist, according to a very worried male witness. Her concoctions could soothe restless bodies, calm nasty coughs, or heal wounds on the flesh. You gotta admire the poetic wording. Of course, the church didn't officially approve, but as long as it stayed quiet and patient, left grateful instead of pregnant. Few bishops asked questions. Easier to assume the nuns were just really good at teasing. Still, darker rumors swirled. Stories of poisons slipped into wine or love potions. Most of these were probably blown way out of proportion. Still, some convents faced investigations for harboring witchy tendencies, which in 15th century Europe was not the kind of attention you wanted from a local inquisitor. For most medieval nuns, public exposure was a spiritual nightmare, but for some, it became a legal necessity, especially when their private scandals went public. All across Europe, convents sometimes found themselves dragged into secular courts. The reasons all over the map: inheritance fights, dowry disputes, property battles, and the more awkward cases, illicit affairs, pregnancies, and behavior completely unbefitting a bride of Christ. That last phrase popped up a lot. medieval law's way of saying someone really messed up. One jaw-dropping case came from Florence, where a nun named Sister Constanza sued a priest for breaking his vows. She claimed he seduced her during confession, promised to quit the priesthood, then spectacularly failed to follow through. She brought letters, witnesses, and a biting poem to back her up. The court was so baffled they delayed the verdict for 3 years, hoping everyone involved would either croak or swear secrecy. Another case in Cologne saw an abbess accused of embezzling convent funds to buy fancy bed linens, spiced wine, and gifts for visitors. Turns out these visitors were young men under 30 treated way more lavishly than your average pilgrim. The trial records read like a luxury hotel's expense report. The abbess claimed the goods were for spiritual hospitality. The court wasn't buying it. Sometimes the church tried to keep things in-house. Canon law was supposed to handle errant nuns, but when crimes crossed into civil territory like theft, child abandonment, or contract fraud, secular judges had to step in, and they were usually unprepared for veiled women, quoting scripture while denying everything with holy outrage. One nun in Burgundy was accused of attacking another nun over a man during questioning. She claimed jealousy and maybe even demonic possession, a 2-for-1 defense that got her a reduced sentence and a transfer elsewhere. These courtroom dramas usually fizzled out fast. The church hated airing dirty laundry in endless soap operas. But gossip spread like wildfire. Local taverns buzzed with lines like, "Did you hear about the nun with the wine tab? Or she brought her dowry and boyfriend to court." In a world where few could read or fact-check, relics were the medieval version of verified badges, and some convents hoarded them with all the restraint of a teen at a clearance sale. Holy bones, scrap fabrics, drops of sacred blood. These trinkets attracted donations and boosted pilgrim cred. For many nuns, relics were a divine connection to heaven. For others, they were just another revenue stream. Take Abbess Euphemia in Thuringia, who claimed her convent had a hair comb belonging to Mary Magdalene herself. Not just any relic, no fragments of the true cross or veil, just a grooming tool from the Bible's most misunderstood woman. Euphemia called it a gift from heaven and encouraged pilgrims to kneel and drop coins. When tested, the bishop found it was almost certainly a local merchant's comb, with a faint scent of herbs and goat. Then there was the convent in Bruges, boasting a fingernail of Saint Apollonia, patron saint of toothaches. Scholars later discovered it was actually a piece of cow horn. The abbess insisted that the miracle came from faith in the relic's meaning, not the relic itself. Bold theology, at least. The medieval version of badges had been verified, and some monasteries collected them with all the restraint of a modern teenager. At a clearance sale, holy bones, scraps of cloth, drops of holy blood. These items attracted donations and the prestige of pilgrims. For many nuns, relics were a sacred connection to heaven. For others, they were basically cash cows. Take Abbess Euphemia in Thuringia, who claimed her monastery had a comb used by Mary Magdalene, not a scrap from the true cross, not a veil fragment, but a grooming tool from the Bible's most misunderstood woman. Euphemia called it a gift from heaven and encouraged pilgrims to kneel and drop coins when checked. The bishop found it was almost certainly a local merchant's comb, smelling faintly of herbs and goat. Then there was the monastery in Bruges, proudly displaying Saint Apollonia's fingernail, patron saint of toothaches. Scholars found it was actually a piece of cow horn. The abbess claimed the miracle wasn't from the relic itself, but from the faith in its meaning. At least that's a bold theological spin. Some nuns got pretty creative. One claimed to have a handkerchief used by the Virgin Mary, still soaked with tears after centuries. Another swore she owned a thorn from the crown of thorns. Despite living in a monastery hundreds of miles from any known trade route, when asked how she got it, she just smiled and said, "God took care of it." Fair enough. Not all these relics were fake. Some actually were legit. Still, our relics worked their magic. Pilgrims showed up, coins jingled, and monasteries that couldn't pull a crowd with sermons realized that bones, real or fake, are pretty great marketing. Behind monastery walls, it wasn't all rosaries and repentance. Some nuns ran soft power empires, managing correspondence, land, and outsmarting bishops while pretending to care deeply about embroidery. These weren't your average nuns. They were materialists, often from noble families, and they knew one crucial thing about medieval life. Influence isn't a sin if you call it stewardship. Take Abbess Matilda of Essen, who ran her monastery like a mini principality. She negotiated land deals, hosted royal visitors, and even publicly corrected the Latin of a visiting count. She was revered as pious and utterly intimidating, a combo that let her get away with technically never leaving the monastery. Many monasteries controlled vast estates. The church might frown on women having power, but had no problem collecting their taxes. That meant abbesses and senior nuns handled finance, agriculture, and disputes with tenants, and like any good landlord, sometimes they bribed local officials, forged a deed or two, and sweet-talked tithes with blessings. A famous Normandy monastery even negotiated a private treaty with a rival one after a fishing rights dispute turned into a full-blown Holy Land grab. The abbess at the time, Sister Juliane, wrote a peace letter scholars still call unusually sharp for a woman sworn to humility. The translation, she totally roasted the opposing abbot in flawless Latin. Then there were the political marriages. Noble families often sent daughters to convents, not always for piety, but for strategy. A nun from the right lineage could act as family ambassador, quietly passing info, lobbying, or even delaying papal decisions with conveniently lost letters. Some monasteries had spies, some had lawyers. One German monastery reportedly hired a scribe who also knew fencing, suggesting their manuscript editing was no joke. Of course, the church noticed and sometimes tried to crack down, but as long as the nuns kept up the pious act, the hierarchy was powerless. You can't excommunicate someone for being too good, even if they basically ran the place like a velvet-gloved mafia. By the late Middle Ages, some monasteries had turned into closed-off towns, complete with economies, hierarchies, gossip, secrets, and yes, the occasional underground baby swap. Not every scandal came with charming smiles or love letters. Some were silent, not the holy kind, but strategic silence, the kind of silence that protects reputations, hides cries, blood, sudden illnesses, nuns mysteriously disappearing after falling ill, their rooms quietly reassigned to new novices amid tears. Because sometimes scandals aren't loud, they're just procedural. Take the case of Abbess Theodora, who ran her monastery like a medieval CEO. She managed lands, hosted dukes, and organized prayer sessions, so elaborate they needed seating charts. When 3 of her novice nuns got pregnant within a year, she had spies, some had lawyers. A monastery in Germany supposedly hired a scribe who also knew fencing. Showing their manuscript editing process was pretty intense. Of course, the church noticed and sometimes tried to crack down, but as long as the nuns kept up the appearance of piety, the hierarchy couldn't do much. We can't. Revoking someone's communion just because they're too good, even when they're clearly running the place like a velvet-gloved mafia boss. By the late Middle Ages, some monasteries had basically turned into closed-off cities, complete with economies, hierarchies, rumors, secrets, and yes, sometimes shady underground baby swaps. Not every scandal came with a charming smile or a pile of love letters. Some kept quiet, not the holy kind of quiet, but the strategic hush-hush kind, the kind that protects reputations, hides sobbing, blood, sudden illnesses, and nuns mysteriously disappearing after falling ill, with their rooms quietly handed over to fresh novices amid tears. Because sometimes scandal isn't loud, it's just procedural. Take Abbess Theodora as an example, who ran her abbey like a medieval CEO. She managed land, entertained dukes, and organized prayer sessions. So elaborate they needed seating charts. When 3 of her novice nuns got pregnant in 1 year, she insisted it was all spiritual temptation and ordered everyone to go on a stricter fast. Everyone but her. Of course, when local clergy raised their eyebrows, she called them jealous and threatened not to pray for their souls. Cold attitude? Even by 14th century standards, other monasteries just leaned on their reputations. St. Lucilla's Abbey on Milan's outskirts quietly earned fame as a refuge for reform-minded women, a vague term for ex-courtesans who now spent 20% of their day praying and 80% rocking fancy robes. They threw music shows, charged admission for festival processions, and kept real peacocks in the garden. The bishop called them a minor concern. Rome called them profitable. Meanwhile, in England, a nun got so good at forging indulgences that her rolls of fake papers ended up all the way at York Cathedral. A bishop even blessed them before someone noticed they were printed with berry juice ink. Even the devout weren't immune to weird habits. One mystic nun claimed she only had visions while fasting and dancing. Her superior eventually banned both, pushing her to invent holy spinning instead. Visitors thought she was possessed. She swore she was just expressing sacred joy at 30 revolutions per minute, because beneath the incense and holy books was something else entirely, a stubborn, primitive creature squeezing through marble cracks. before becoming the world's most legendary barrel-dwelling philosopher. Diogenes was just the son of a banker in Sinope, Greece. Yes, the guy who later mocked gold and trashed real wealth was literally born into money, and it didn't last. Diogenes' life took a turn when he and his dad, Hesius, got accused of counterfeiting local currency. Not metaphorically, they were literally forging coins, either thinning them out or faking them. Still debated if Diogenes knew what he was doing or was just helping Dad run the family biz. But one thing's clear, the local authorities were not amused, so the future cynic got kicked out. Fast. Now, for most people, exile would be a tragedy. For Diogenes, it was a career move. He fled to Athens, the Greek philosophical hub, and decided instead of crawling back into polite society, he'd tear it down, bit by bit, with sarcasm, sharp words, and zero cares about clothes. Athens was full of respected thinkers and slick sophists. Plato, Aristotle, the whole gang. Diogenes, dirt poor and technically homeless, didn't care, while others debated metaphysics in linen robes. He hit the town, grinning like a dog on a mission, expose every bit of hypocrisy he could sniff out. And yes, dog isn't a metaphor. He embraced it. In fact, he proudly identified with the Greek word kynikos, meaning dog, which is basically where we get cynic, growling at corruption, biting conventions, and licking bare truths without any filter. His first act, ditch all social pretenses. He gave up wealth, mocked etiquette, and slept in a giant ceramic jar, often mistaken for a barrel like a philosophical panda. That was his final statement. If society was just a shell, he'd live outside it, literally. This wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. Diogenes believed virtue came from living in harmony with nature, and nature didn't want money, fame, or a 10-room villa. It just wanted honesty and maybe a solid jar. If Athens was the center of philosophical prestige, Plato was its golden child, polished, revered, and way too serious for Diogenes' tastes. While Plato classified virtues and defined abstract ideals, Diogenes pissed on them literally and figuratively. One famous story is about Plato trying to define a human as a featherless biped. He thought it was a clever summary of us. Diogenes, ever ready with a reputation or a 10-room villa. Nah, it just needed honesty and maybe a sturdy jug. If Athens was the hub of philosophical clout, Plato was its golden child, polished, revered, and way too serious for Diogenes' taste. While Plato sorted virtues and defined lofty ideals, Diogenes pissed all over them, literally and figuratively. One classic story involves Plato trying to define a human as a two-legged featherless animal. He thought it was a clever summary of humanity. Diogenes, always ready to mock, plucked a chicken bear and marched it into the academy, shouting, "Behold, Plato's man." The joke shocked Plato into revising his definition, adding with broad flat nails, points for detail. But Diogenes wasn't just trolling. He thought philosophers like Plato had gotten lost in abstract nonsense and forgotten how to live honestly. For Diogenes, virtue wasn't about fancy ideas. We're way too caught up in abstract nonsense, forgetting how to actually live with integrity. To Diogenes, virtue wasn't something to debate, it was something to live. And if that meant yelling at the intellectual elites while chewing on onions and looking like a homeless guy, so be it. He had a habit of crashing Plato's lectures, strolling through crowds with a lantern in broad daylight, muttering he was searching for an honest man. The crowd laughed, but deep down they knew he was onto something. Athens, with all its democratic ideals and marble buildings, had turned into a playground of polite lies and philosophical performances. Diogenes tore that all apart with blunt honesty. Plato supposedly called Diogenes a mad Socrates, and honestly, that's not far off. Like Socrates, Diogenes asked the annoying questions and refused to play by society's rules. But unlike Socrates, Diogenes didn't want a conversation. He wanted a show, and he was more than happy to play the fool if it meant exposing the bullshit. He made simple living look absurd. He begged without shame, hiked whatever he could find, went to the bathroom wherever he pleased, often grossing people out. But every crude act was a philosophical statement. Why be ashamed of natural functions when others aren't ashamed of lying, cheating, and hoarding wealth while Plato built ideal worlds? Diogenes smashed the illusions of this one, and if you asked him, that made him a real philosopher, even if he smelled a bit like old olives and existential dread. Now a full-time philosophical menace, he had no fixed address, except for a giant clay jar he slept in, hidden in the market like some savvy street art. He owned almost nothing: a cloak, a staff, a cup, until he saw a kid drinking water with his hands and flung the cup away. A child schooled me on simple living. That's what made Diogenes special. It wasn't just about simplicity. It stripped everyone down. It didn't pretend to reject wealth while secretly stashing silver under the mattress. No, it really lived off scraps, bathed in rainwater, and slept with dogs. In fact, he often called himself a dog not to insult himself, but as a badge of honor. Dogs live naturally. No shame, no pretense, no obsession with status. And that's exactly how Diogenes wanted to live. Bark and all. Then there's the lantern or lamp, depending on the translation, that he famously carried around during the day. "What are you doing?" people would ask. He grumbled that he was looking for an honest man. Of course, the metaphor was crystal clear. He wasn't finding a damn thing. He wasn't even hoping. The point was the joke. A slap in the face to anyone who pretends to be virtuous while living a life full of compromises. His everyday life became performance art. Every gesture a lesson. Once, he was caught masturbating in public, and rumor has it, he joked, "If rubbing my belly could ease hunger that easily." Rude, absolutely. But to Diogenes, natural acts weren't shameful. Hypocrisy was, and we have to understand, Diogenes wasn't poor because he had to be. He was offered housing, food, even sponsorship from wealthy admirers. He turned them down like someone dodging a pyramid scheme. For him, accepting charity meant tying himself to obligations. And Diogenes wasn't about to be tied down, not for money, not for politeness, and definitely not because society's awkward coughs made him stop doing uncivilized stuff in public. He didn't live on society's fringe. He planted himself there like a thorn sharp, annoying and impossible to ignore, while everyone else, he planted himself there like a thorn sharp, annoying, impossible to ignore, while everyone else was busy polishing their masks. Diogenes bragged about his stains in a world full of roles and rituals. That was the most rebellious act of all, one of the most iconic meetings in ancient philosophy, and maybe all history, happened between the dirtiest man in Athens and the most powerful man on earth. Alexander the Great showed up, a young conqueror with the ego of a god and a mighty army to back it up. After hearing stories about Diogenes, Alexander got curious. This was a man who had nothing, wanted nothing, feared nothing, yet managed to get all of Greece talking. Naturally, Alexander had to meet him. He found Diogenes lounging in his barrel, sunbathing like a sassy stray cat, who just happens to be an ethics philosophy pro. The Macedonian king approached and asked the famous question, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And Diogenes, without even sitting up, replied, "Yeah, move out of my sunlight, you big crybaby." Alexander's entourage was horrified. This guy just dismissed the ruler of most of the known world like a pesky street vendor. But Alexander was impressed. Legend says he turned to his men and said, "If I weren't Alexander, I wish I were Diogenes." That's the kind of line history professors love quoting, and YouTube comments usually get wrong. But regardless of historical accuracy, this moment perfectly captured Diogenes' essence in a world obsessed with power. He became untouchable because he didn't care about any of it. The man didn't want anything at all. No palace, no army, no reputation to protect. You can't bribe a guy who sleeps in a barrel. You can't blackmail a guy begging for scraps. And you definitely can't impress a man who thinks luxury is a joke. What Diogenes taught Alexander and the world is that real power comes from needing nothing and fearing no one. That was Diogenes' ultimate rebellion. No street shouting, no smashing, social customs, just stripping life down to its bare bones and daring anyone to call themselves poor with just one line. He turned one of history's greatest conquerors into a shadow blocking out the sun, and unlike most philosophers, Diogenes didn't just preach freedom. He lived it so fully that even emperors felt small around him. Now imagine trying to impress your friends after that. Good luck with that. By then, Diogenes wasn't just some local weirdo. He was the embodiment of a new way of thinking skepticism, not that boring, grumpy political moaning we associate with it today. No, original skepticism was wild, blunt, and pretty negative. Diogenes believed society had rotted because it was built on lies. Lies about happiness, virtue, success. People spent their whole lives chasing wealth, climbing social ladders, stuffing their heads with meaningless abstract nonsense. Diogenes looked at all that and said, "No thanks. I'd rather sleep in a barrel and eat leftovers." Basically, skepticism aimed at living in harmony with nature. That meant ditching all fake needs luxury, fame, political ambition, and going back to a simple, self-sufficient life. If nature didn't give you a golden cup, maybe you didn't need one. And if nature gave you a stomach, then yeah, begging for bread or stealing an onion is way more honest than kissing up to a politician. His philosophy was also deeply confrontational. Diogenes didn't hide his beliefs in essays or dusty scrolls in a temple. He lived them loud and proud. He mocked, barked, and even barged into people's lives to force them to face their own contradictions. If someone preached virtue but lived lavishly, Diogenes would follow them like a philosophical pest, exposing the rot beneath the silk. For Diogenes, action mattered way more than ideas. He even said, "Other dogs bite their enemies. I bite my friends to save them, because nothing says friendship like a metaphorical nibble on your delusional ankle." He was especially brutal towards its hypocrisy, especially among philosophers. If a scholar claimed poverty was noble while living comfortably, Diogenes would hold up a mirror, literally or figuratively. Once, he saw a luxurious temple being built and declared, "The gods must be blind if they need a house this big in a world obsessed with image." Diogenes was the natural predator of image, while others hid their ambitions behind fancy words. He stripped everything bare, literally and figuratively. He wasn't trying to be popular. He was trying to wake people up. And if that meant barking like a dog or peeing on public statues, so be it. After all, truth isn't always polite. Diogenes wasn't just a philosopher. He was the walking conscience of Athens, a dirty, noisy, brutally inconvenient place. Depending on who you asked, he could be a crazy guy with bowel control issues or the only sane man in a city full of liars, probably both. He built his career on offending people. Once, at a banquet, he walked barefoot across the expensive dining room carpet, wiped mud off his feet, and muttered, "There, I just trampled Plato's pride." Not exactly polite behavior, but for Diogenes, it wasn't just rudeness. It was a protest against vanity, excess, and all the empty rituals people impose on themselves to feel important. He challenged everyone when he saw a rich guy donating to the poor just to be admired. Diogenes muttered, "That's not charity. That's an investment." Once, he saw a man. He got mad after getting slapped and said, "You shouldn't be angry. It's just meat hitting meat. This isn't just philosophy. It's psychological judo." But Diogenes' real genius wasn't just in what he said. It was how he said it. Of course, not everyone appreciated these free lessons. He got mocked, attacked, and even arrested. Though trying to arrest a man with no possessions and zero shame is like trying to confiscate cigarettes. In one city, after being arrested and sold into slavery, yes, seriously, he calmly told the auctioneer, "Sell me to a man who needs a master. Think about that. Eventually, he met a guy from Corinth named Xeniades, who didn't just buy Diogenes, he took him home, let him run the household, teach the kids, basically become a sarcastic life coach. Somehow, Diogenes turned slavery into a lecture series. Whether insulting kings or schooling kids, he was stubborn to the point of pain. He mocked every power structure, even the ones he accidentally became part of. If anyone tried to praise him too much, he'd remind them he was just a hound chasing truth and occasionally peeing on golden statues. He was like society's permanent splinter. The more you tried to ignore him, the deeper he dug into your conscience. Saying Diogenes had strong opinions on social conventions is like saying the sun is kinda warm. He didn't just reject polite customs. He waged a one-man war against them with the fury of a barefoot prophet and the hygiene habits of a rebellious panda. Bathing an overrated ritual, shame pointless, tools for cowards and hypocrites to hide behind their marble columns. Diogenes believed most social norms weren't there to help people. They existed to control them, shame them, and separate the powerful from the poor. So naturally, he decided to live in total defiance of all those rules. He often walked barefoot on filthy streets, even in winter. When asked why no shoes, he said, "If I need shoes, I'll suffer more about my life than my feet." Diogenes was also a pro at pulling embarrassing public stunts, not from ignorance, but on purpose. He knew exactly what he was doing. These weren't random acts. They were statements. He believed if something's natural and necessary, it shouldn't be a source of shame. In other words, if you're gonna yell at me for burping, but not for lying to the neighbors, your moral compass is broken. Even begging became a form of protest. While most beggars plead for pity or social duty, Diogenes turned it into a challenge for both sides. If they said yes, fine. If not, no big deal. Either way, he stayed honest and hungry. But Diogenes wasn't just a rebel for rebellion's sake. His whole life was a constant experiment to see how little a person really needs to live well. Not just survive, but live well, with dignity, freedom, and a sharp enough sense of humor to puncture the fancy airs of politicians and the flowery language of philosophers. He exposed the absurdity of conventions by flat out ignoring them. And the more people insisted he behave normally, the harder he worked to prove that so-called civilized behavior is just rituals we do to feel superior. In a world obsessed with masks, Diogenes went barefaced and probably barefoot, laughing in the sunshine, asking why we don't do the same. Of course, Diogenes didn't leave behind memoirs, marble busts, or temples to honor him. He wouldn't want any of that. In fact, if someone tried to build a statue, he'd probably spit on it. Not ignorance. He knew exactly what he was doing. These actions weren't random. They were statements. He believed if something is natural and necessary, it shouldn't be a source of shame. In other words, if you're gonna scold me for burping, but not for lying to the neighbors, your moral compass is seriously broken. Even begging became a form of protest. While most beggars try to tug at your heartstrings or guilt you into giving money, Diogenes treated it like a challenge, both for himself and for whoever was asked. If they said yes, great. If not, no big deal. either way. He stayed honest and hungry, but Diogenes wasn't just rebelling for some rebellion's sake. His whole life was one big experiment to see how little a person actually needs to live well. Not just survive, but live well with dignity, freedom, and a sharp enough sense of humor to poke holes in politicians' fancy suits and philosophers' flowery language. He exposed the absurdity of social conventions by flat out ignoring them. And the more people insisted he act normal, the harder he tried to prove that so-called civilized behavior is really just rituals we do to feel superior in a world obsessed with masks. Dionysus went barefaced and maybe barefoot, joking under the sun, asking why the rest of us can't do the same. Of course, Dionysus left no memoirs, marble busts, or temples in his honor. He wouldn't want any. In fact, if someone tried to build a statue for him, he probably would have spit on it. His legacy living not in what you create, but in what you destroy. Illusions, vanity, and ego. As for his deaths, like everything else about Dionysus, it's wrapped in stories both tragic, ridiculous, and oddly fitting. Some say he died holding his breath out of boredom with life. Others say he died from a dog bite. The irony there is pretty delicious for anyone who knows his nickname. Then there's the version, ridiculous, yet somehow perfect. Some say the man died from holding his breath out of sheer boredom with life. Others claim he died from a dog bite. Quite the irony for anyone who knows his nickname. And then there's the version where he just lay down, said nothing, and never got up. No last words, no dramatic curtain call, just the world's loudest skeptic quietly checking out. Like even death couldn't impress him. When asked how he wanted to be buried, Dionysus supposedly said, "Throw me out beyond the city walls and let the wild animals feast." Shocked, someone asked if he wasn't worried about being torn apart. Dionysus replied, "Nope, just give me a stick to shoo them away, but you won't be able to use it," the man pointed out. "Then why should I care what happens to me after I'm dead?" Dionysus wins, death loses. For centuries after his death, Dionysus's teachings didn't vanish. They spread like wildfire among people sick of fakery. His skeptical style inspired a whole school of thought, influencing later Stoics like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, who borrowed his ideas about self-reliance and virtue untainted by cash or fame. Even today, in an era obsessed with filters, followers, and money, Dionysus still feels oddly relevant. He's the reminder that real freedom isn't about owning more stuff. It's about needing less. That dignity doesn't come from titles, but from living true to your values. Even if those values include yelling at statues and crashing in a barrel, he might have died broke, homeless, and barefoot. But Dionysus left behind something way more lasting than gold, uncomfortable truth, the kind that sticks in your brain like a splinter and dares you to laugh at yourself, or at least wonder why you didn't bring a flashlight. You'd think a guy yelling at crowds, sleeping in a jar, and openly trashing Plato would just be a forgotten footnote in philosophy. Instead, Dionysus became a symbol not of madness but of ruthless honesty in a world built on illusions. The fact we're still talking about him 2,000 years later says something. It shows that deep down, humans still crave truth, even if it smells like onions and lives in a barrel. Dionysus matters today because his life was a dare. He dared to ask, what happens when you stop playing games? What if you quit chasing wealth, fame, even comfort, and just lived with what you really need? Drop all the performances, polite lies, curated identities. What's left, according to Dionysus, that's real freedom. In a society built on image, ancient Athens or Instagram, his rejection of appearances is more powerful than ever. He didn't just question power or wealth. He questioned whether we even need them. That's why so many thinkers, from Stoics to anarchists to comedians, draw inspiration from him. He's the original minimalist, the spiritual godfather of every story you've heard about ditching a six-figure job to live in a van. Even Dionysus's rudeness has its place. He used shock not to offend, but to expose truth. He wanted people to feel uncomfortable because that's where reflection begins. That discomfort is the start of thinking. If you get more grossed out by someone peeing in public than by government corruption or religious greed, Dionysus would say, you've got your priorities backwards. Though his methods were unorthodox, his core message has stood the test of time. Virtue isn't something you buy, label, or market. It's how you live when no one's watching, or in Dionysus's case, when everyone's watching and you don't care. He reminds us wisdom doesn't always wear a robe of what's necessary. That's why so many thinkers, from Stoics to anarchists to comedians, find inspiration in him. He was the original minimalist, the spiritual godfather of every story you've heard about quitting a six-figure job to live in a van you see all over the internet. Even Diogenes' rudeness has its place. He used shock not to offend, but to reveal the truth. He wanted people to feel uncomfortable because that's where reflection begins. Discomfort is where reflection begins. If you're more grossed out by someone going to the bathroom in public than by government corruption or religious greed, Diogenes would say, you have your priorities seriously messed up. Though his methods were unorthodox, the core message stands the test of time. Virtue isn't something you buy, label, or advertise. It's how you live when no one's watching, or in Diogenes' case, or when everyone's watching and you just don't care. He reminds us that wisdom doesn't always wear a cloak. Sometimes it yells inside a jar, laughs in your face, and refuses to come out into the sunlight. In a world full of noise, branding, and nonsense, Diogenes invites us to be something different, honest, unfiltered, and a little bit like a dog. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes him the wisest madman ever. By the early 1870s, the northern plains were boiling over with tension, the slow buildup of land theft and cultural clashes. Right in the middle of this storm were the Black Hills, sacred land to the Lakota Sioux, who called it Paha Sapa. The U.S. government had officially recognized this land as theirs in the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. On paper, that land was theirs forever. Forever, in this case, meaning about 6 years. Everything changed in 1874 when gold was discovered in the Black Hills by an expedition led by none other than George Armstrong Custer. News spread like flies on honey, and thousands of gold seekers swarmed the area, breaking the treaty and trampling on sacred ground. The government, instead of enforcing the agreement, tried to buy the land from the Lakota. They said no. The issue wasn't just gold, it was survival, sovereignty, and the erosion of their way of life to Washington. The Lakota and their allies were now enemies. They weren't negotiating, they were resisting. The U.S. Army was ordered to shove all native groups onto reservations by January 31st, 1876. Any group that didn't comply would be labeled enemies. Many didn't even get the memo since they'd scattered across vast winter hunting grounds. Others just flat out refused. They had no intention of trading their freedom for a life of dependence and captivity. What was building on the plains wasn't just disagreement. It was a full-on collision, a loose alliance of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, led by legends like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, started to band together, not an official army, but a fierce crew determined to protect their land, people, and way of life. They knew war was coming. Meanwhile, U.S. military planners, cocky about their numbers and tech, wrote off the tribes as disorganized and divided. They couldn't have been more wrong. These plains warriors were lightning fast, deeply familiar with the terrain, and driven by the fiercest motives. The powder keg was lit, the fuse was burning, and soon enough, the showdown known as the Battle of Little Bighorn went down in history. Just your average army officer. By 1876, he was a household name, a flashy Civil War hero, divisive and notorious for being bold, reckless, and dangerously addicted to glory, with his wild blonde hair, bright uniform, and craving the spotlight. Custer looked more like a stage star than a battlefield commander, but his daring earned him both respect and ire. After the Civil War, Custer was reassigned to the western frontier as a colonel leading the 7th U.S. Cavalry. His job enforce federal Native American policy, which basically meant forcing native tribes onto reservations peacefully if possible, or with guns if necessary. By 1876, Custer was itching for a fight. His political ambitions simmered, and a decisive military win could revive his reputation after a very public falling out with President Ulysses Grant's administration. He wasn't just chasing Native Americans. He was chasing relevance, as tensions with the Lakota and their allies rose. Custer was ordered to join a three-pronged campaign to locate and crush the enemies. The plan was to surround the native camps and force them to surrender. Custer's troops would come from the east, while General John Gibbon's forces approached from the west, and General George Crook's from the south. But right from the start, the plan hit a snag thanks to overconfidence and lousy coordination, rugged terrain, long distances, and shaky intel. Most U.S. officers, including Custer, believed they were facing a small, scattered band of warriors. Little did they know thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had gathered that summer near the Little Bighorn River, the largest native force ever assembled on the plains. Custer, as usual, wanted a quick strike and all the glory for himself. He refused reinforcements, left his Gatling guns behind to keep his pace up, and ignored orders to wait. Instead, he pushed forward with 600 men, splitting into 3 battalions for a surprise attack. Bold, reckless, and catastrophically wrong, because what lay ahead wasn't some broken village of lost souls. It was a united, battle-hardened force ready to defend their way of life, and Custer, at his peak swagger, was about to charge straight into legend and disaster, while the U.S. Army operated on maps and faulty assumptions. Something extraordinary was happening along the Little Bighorn River. Thousands of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho gathered not initially for war, but for a traditional summer camp. Time to rest, hunt, hold ceremonies, and bond like family and allies. But the political reality of 1876 cast a dark shadow over this gathering. Native leaders knew what was coming. They had watched treaties broken, buffalo herds vanish, and railroads and settlers encroach. They understood that this camp, peaceful as it seemed, could soon become a battlefield, and they weren't planning to run. At the heart of this growing alliance was Sitting Bull, a sacred Lakota man and visionary leader. In the weeks before the battle, he performed a powerful Sundance dance, a grueling ritual of sacrifice and prayer. Witnesses claimed Sitting Bull had a vision during the dance. He saw soldiers dropping into the camp like locusts, defeated and broken. For his followers, this wasn't metaphor, it was prophecy. Then there was Crazy Horse, a warrior with near-legendary skill and courage, quiet, reclusive, and fiercely protective of his people. Crazy Horse was known as a fearless leader in previous battles. He quickly proved his worth by charging enemy lines with a mix of boldness and tactical genius. Other leaders like Gall and Two Moons also rose as key voices, though the tribes didn't operate under a single command. Their unity at this moment was impressive. They were defending more than land. They were defending freedom itself. Estimates vary, but there could have been $8,000 to 10 Gallows natives in the Little Bighorn Valley, including 500 to 2,000 warriors. They were well armed, many with rifles, and deeply familiar with the terrain. Most importantly, they fought for home, family, and their way of life. Custer expected a few hundred desperate warriors. Instead, he was about to face a formidable alliance, born not just from resistance, but fierce spiritual determination, ancestral duty, and a raw will to survive. The storm was brewing. On June 22nd, 1876, Custer and his 7th Cavalry left the Rosebud River, following trails supposedly leading to a nearby native camp. For 3 days, they pushed so hard both men and horses were running on empty. Custer was convinced that The native village would bolt if they caught wind soldiers were coming. He wanted to strike first, strike hard, and steal the glory before Generals Terry or Gibbon showed up and hogged all the attention. But that urgency made him forget about caution. Scouts, including the famous Crow and Arikara warriors, warned Custer that the village ahead was huge, nothing like any they'd seen before. Some even climbed nearby mountains and came back wide-eyed, saying, "Too many to count." They begged Custer to wait and think it over. He didn't listen. On the morning of June 25th, Custer reached a hillside overlooking Little Bighorn Valley. From far away, he could spot a part of the massive camp. Teepee tents stretched along the river like a tiny city. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Kids played. Horses grazed. But what he saw as a vulnerable village was actually a sleeping giant. Still convinced he could surprise them, Custer made the fateful decision to split his 600-man regiment. He sent Captain Frederick Benteen to scout south with 125 men. Major Marcus Reno was ordered to attack the southern edge of the village with 140 men. Meanwhile, Custer personally led about 210 men north, hoping to hit the village's flank from behind and trap them. The warriors had set a pincer attack. Bold move, risky as hell and based on some seriously bad assumptions. Custer didn't know that. The warriors were already aware the soldiers were coming. Lakota scouts spotted dust clouds and troops moving. Surprise was gone before it even began. When Reno's men moved down the valley, they didn't see panicked families running away. They saw more warriors gathering than they expected, and instead of collapsing, this group exploded into organized resistance, led by precisely the people Custer had underestimated. That's when the legend of the unbeatable U.S. Army started to crumble. The 7th Cavalry was charging straight into a storm they couldn't outrun, with Custer leading the charge right into the eye of it, around 3 p.m. On June 25th, 1876, Major Marcus Reno and his men attacked the southern tip of the native camp. What they expected was chaos, women and children fleeing, warriors struggling. Instead, they got fierce, organized resistance. Within minutes, it was over. Reno's men dismounted in the riverside woods and opened fire. But the amount of return fire shocked them. The warriors weren't just numerous, they were fierce, agile, and coordinated. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors charged across the open ground at terrifying speed, many on horseback, shooting with deadly accuracy. Some carried Winchester and Spencer rifles way better than the single-shot carbines the cavalry had. Reno panicked. Instead of holding his ground, he ordered a chaotic retreat across the river. Many soldiers were shot down. During the fight, some drowned. The retreat turned into a bloody, disorganized mess as Reno's men staggered up a cliff east of the river, desperately trying to form a defensive position. Then Captain Frederick Benteen arrived from the south with reinforcements. He and Reno set up a makeshift perimeter on top of what would later be called Reno Hill. They dug in, thirsty, surrounded, and under constant fire. They could hear gunfire to the north. The sound signaling Custer's fate was unfolding. But they had no idea exactly what was happening. They sent messengers, but none returned. Meanwhile, down in the valley, native warriors poured across the battlefield. Energized by Reno's retreat, spirits soared. The prophecy came true. The invaders were not invincible. Just as they fled, more warriors joined the fight. Up to this point, military campaigns had been predictable. Native groups had learned to deal with overwhelming forces, lightning attacks, and fierce retaliation. The invader wasn't invincible. They were running, and more reinforcements showed up. So far, juiciest military campaigns in the air have been predictable. Native groups learned to handle overwhelming forces, quick strikes, and brutal retaliation. But this time was different. The warriors fought their own way, flexible, decisive, fueled by vision and fury. While Reno clung to life atop the hill, clueless about what just happened, Custer kept pushing north, completely unaware that the whole tactical framework he relied on had crumbled. This battle was no longer about strategy. It had become a fight for survival, and Custer's time was running out. Meanwhile, Reno's forces were retreating in chaos, and Benteen was holding Reno Hill. Custer and his 210 men moved north, completely clueless about the scale of the battle raging behind them, still deluded into thinking the village could be attacked from multiple directions. Custer's army marched along high ground, hoping to hit the village's rear. But the warriors knew he was coming by now. Alarm bells were echoing across the massive camp. Hundreds of fierce Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors surged toward Custer's troops. Instead of looking for women and kids to capture, Custer found himself facing a tidal wave of mounted warriors. His army spread thin along ridges and hills, desperately trying to hold defensive positions. But they were quickly surrounded. The exact sequence of events is still debated. No one survived under Custer's direct command. But one thing's clear. The 7th Cavalry was crushed in just a few hours. The native forces, led by warriors like Crazy Horse and Gall, defeated and overwhelmed Custer's men. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain and hit-and-run tactics shredded the cavalry's formations. The soldiers who tried to make a stand on what's now called Last Stand Hill, surrounded, out of ammo and with no way out, fell one by one. Some stuck together in small groups, some went solo, some are said to have shot themselves rather than be captured. The natives described the battle as brutal and lightning fast. It wasn't just a fight, it was a collapse. Custer was killed in the final moments, likely shot in the chest and head. They found him among a group of men, including his brother Tom and Boston Custer. Nearly all the soldiers under his command were dead. Over 200 men wiped out for the native warriors. It was an incredible, emotional victory, but it wasn't celebrated with wild cheers. Some accounts describe more mourning than joy, somber understanding that even though they won, the war wasn't over. The U.S. Army would be back, and this moment of glory would soon face revenge. Yet, in just one day, on those rolling Montana hills, The unstoppable machine of westward expansion stumbled, and Custer, the bold commander chasing legacy, found his not in conquest, but in destruction, as the last dust settled on the evening of June 25th. Silence returned to the Little Bighorn Hills, smoldering fires, scattered ammo, and over 200 dead soldiers of the 7th Cavalry, including George Armstrong Custer and most officers under his direct command. The battlefield was a mess of broken weapons, fallen horses, and men who'd never seen anything like it. But the native victory, as complete as it was, came with a harsh reality. This was not the end. It was a spark. The U.S. government, humiliated and furious, would not forgive what they called a massacre back east. Newspapers blasted Custer's last stand, painting him as a martyr, and the native warriors as bloodthirsty invaders. The context: treaty violations, gold fever in sacred lands, and the defensive nature of the battle conveniently vanished from the national story in the days after. Native families mourned their own losses, despite winning. They suffered casualties too, and they knew the American response would be swift. Some leaders, including Sitting Bull, urged quick action. They destroyed the large military camp and scattered into smaller groups across the plains, preparing for the revenge they knew was coming soon. The reinforced and better armed U.S. Army poured into the area. The defeat at Little Bighorn only hardened Washington's resolve. Policies grew harsher, treaties were shredded. More troops arrived. Negotiation was off the table. It was all about domination. Sitting Bull eventually fled north to Canada to escape capture, while Crazy Horse fought on for another year before being killed in the sketchy situation in 1877. Lots of starving. Defeated folks were forced onto reservations, their freedom ripped away. The battlefield itself was found by reinforcements 2 days later. What they saw was bleak and haunting. Many soldiers had their uniforms and gear stripped off, a warrior tradition to rob the enemy of dignity. Some bodies were mutilated, others left intact, depending on tribal customs and how fierce the fighting got. But no one could deny what had happened. Custer was gone. The 7th Cavalry was wiped out, and for a brief moment, native resistance actually pulled off the impossible. They won. The Battle of Little Bighorn wasn't just some military scuffle. It turned into a symbol, twisted by history and weaponized for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. It was a rare, hard-earned victory. For the U.S. government and its people, it was a humiliating slap that demanded ruthless revenge. In the American imagination, the story quickly got distorted. Custer went from reckless glory chaser to tragic hero, the brave general who fought to the bitter end. The complexity of his decisions, the arrogance of his tactics, and the injustice of the U.S. invasion on treaty-protected lands all got swept away in a wave of patriotic myth-making. The press called the native victory a massacre, erasing the fact it was defensive fighting on home soil, but within native communities. This battle is remembered very differently. It's a moment of unity, courage, and a prophecy fulfilled. The Big's fort at Little Bighorn symbolizes the last bright flash of freedom before the long shadow of reservation life. Closed in, for many, the battle became a source of pride, proof of resistance and resilience. It proves that the Plains native peoples weren't just passive victims, they were active defenders of their world. But the price for that victory came fast. Within months, military campaigns ramped up. The buffalo, already decimated, were now deliberately targeted to destroy native food sources. Tribes were relentlessly pursued. By 1877, Crazy Horse was dead. Sitting Bull lasted longer, but was eventually killed in 1890, just days before the Wounded Knee Massacre, another tragic milestone in the erasure of native sovereignty. And so, the legacy of Little Bighorn became both inspiration and sorrow. It exposed the cruelty of U.S. expansion, broken promises, and the fierce refusal of a people to be quietly erased. Today, the battlefield is a national monument. For years, it only honored Custer and his men, but recently, memorials have been built to honor the native warriors who fought and died there not as villains, but as heroes defending their homeland. The hills remember both sides. The wind carries both songs, and the legacy of Little Bighorn still matters if you are willing to listen to more than one version of history in America's grand story. Little Bighorn stands out as one of the rare moments when the underdog didn't just fight back, but actually won. In just one day in 1876, native warriors stopped an empire's invasion wave. They didn't win with numbers, tech, or wealth. They won with courage, unity, and the stubborn will to protect their way of life. But the tragedy of Little Bighorn is that this victory didn't change history's outcome. It just delayed it. In fact, it sped up the end. Custer's shocking defeat sent Washington into a furious rage. Public opinion hardened. Sympathy for native grievances, if it existed, was buried under waves of revenge and nationalism. Congress boosted military budgets. The campaign against the Plains tribes turned savage. Within a few years, the nomadic life that defined Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho culture for centuries was gone. The buffalo were almost extinct. Reservations were carved up. Lands were chopped into pieces. The hills that once echoed with hoofbeats, the horses and battle cries have gone silent. But Little Bighorn refuses to fade away. For decades, it's been retold, reimagined, and resurrected. For many Americans, it starts as a heroic tale of sacrifice. For others, it slowly morphs into a symbol of injustice, a nation breaking its promises and calling rebellion treason. Today, it's one of the few battlefields that honors both sides, with memorials facing in every direction. For Native peoples, the battle remains deeply symbolic, not the start of defeat, but the last stand of a free people. The moment everything was ripped away, the land, freedom, dignity fought for with every ounce of spirit left. It's, and always will be, a sacred memory. And for everyone else, Little Bighorn delivers a tough but necessary lesson about power, myth, and the cost of conquest. It reminds us history isn't always told by the winners. Sometimes it's buried beneath them, waiting to be dug up. In the end, Custer might have snagged the glory, but the Yesu Little Bighorn warriors earned something way more lasting: truth and the right to speak. We were here and we fought. The Forbidden City wasn't just built, it was constructed with an obsession for control. In 1406, Emperor Yongle of the Ming Dynasty ordered a new palace in Beijing to shift the capital from Nanjing. But this wasn't your average palace. It was to be the heart of the Chinese Empire, a city within a city, where no one entered without summons, and no secret slipped past its walls unnoticed. Over the next 14 years, over 1 million workers, craftsmen, and engineers busted their humps to finish this colossal project. The materials alone came from all corners of the empire: golden Nanmu wood from Sichuan, massive marble blocks dragged across frozen rivers, and millions of glazed tiles fired to perfection. Brick by brick, the pride of an empire was etched in stone. When finished, the Forbidden City covered nearly 180 acres with over 900 buildings. Its layout strictly followed Confucian principles: symmetrical, orderly, hierarchical. At its center stood the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where emperors were crowned and decrees issued across the bureaucracy. But beyond grandeur, its deeper purpose was psychological. This wasn't just a residence, it was a statement. The emperor didn't live among you, he lived above you. And make no mistake, that was seriously enforced. Everyday Beijing citizens never set foot inside. Even high officials only entered with imperial permission. Guards stood at every gate. Spies lurked in every hallway. The city's outskirts bustled with markets and daily life. But inside those red walls, time slowed and rituals ruled. It was a closed-off world of ceremony, shrouded in mystery and cut off from the chaos outside. Yet beneath the golden roofs and crimson pillars, the Forbidden City was also a pressure cooker. With all its beauty, it was built to isolate, centralize power, and protect the emperor from threats both physical and political. Over time, it became a place of conspiracy, betrayal, and whispered secrets in the dark. A palace for sure, but also the stage for 5 centuries of empire, ambition, and slow decay. From the outside, it dazzles. From within, it watches and never forgets those who walk its halls. At the heart of the Forbidden City is the Emperor, the Son of Heaven, the living bridge between the mortal and divine. But despite all his cosmic power, the man on the throne often lived an extremely isolated life. The Forbidden City didn't just protect the emperor, it swallowed him whole. Every day of his life was scripted with suffocating precision. He woke to music, was dressed by servants, and followed a schedule so strict it was practically theater. His meals were sampled for poison. Ministers kneeled before him, reading aloud official documents. Even strolling in the garden required ceremonial permission and a whole entourage. Nothing was left to chance, spontaneous. Everything was watched, and even though the emperor sat at the top of the pecking order, He wasn't exactly free. The very system that propped him up was also his prison, surrounded by layers of officials, ministers, concubines, and spies. The emperor rarely saw the outside world. His info was filtered, his interactions managed, and his ability to act independently, especially in later dynasties, was often strangled by an over-the-top court ritual machine. Some emperors handled this with brutal efficiency, like Yongjing or Kangxi, ruling with an iron fist and mastering the bureaucracy. Others paranoia, decay, or self-isolation, drifting like golden ghosts in their own palaces. Some spent months, even years inside the Forbidden City, without stepping outside its walls. The world they ruled was basically as accessible as the moon, even inside the palace. Getting near the emperor was tightly controlled. High officials might wait days just to get a glimpse. Family visits were restricted, and heaven helped the servant who stepped out of line. Protocol dictated where you stood, how you bowed, and even what you were allowed to see. In theory, the emperor could command an army with a single word. In reality, he had to fight just to figure out who to trust or what was actually happening beyond his walls. The throne might be carved from jade and propped on dragons, but it was also shrouded in curtains, secrets upon secrets, and endless ceremony. The Forbidden City crowned the emperor with gold, but wrapped him in silence. Behind every throne in the Forbidden City stood an invisible army, not generals or ministers, but eunuchs, castrated men serving inside the palace. Eunuchs started as humble servants, but became some of the most powerful and terrifying figures in feudal China. In a world where women were locked away and men were threats, eunuchs held a strange middle ground, close to the emperor but politically useful since they could never start rival dynasties. At first, their job was simple: manage palace chores, deliver messages, care for the emperor's robes. But as emperors grew more reclusive, especially in the Ming and Qing dynasties, eunuchs began to fill crucial roles. They controlled access to the emperor, filtered information, and eventually ran the whole administrative show. Some wielded more power than generals. Others enjoyed the emperor's trust, like even his family didn't. And power, of course, came with ambition and corruption. Eunuchs' history in the Forbidden City is a cycle of rise and fall. With every loyal servant came a plan to manipulate imperial decisions, silence critics, and hoard wealth. Some, like Jiang Xian at the end of the Ming, effectively ran the empire from behind silk curtains. Enemies disappeared, allies got promoted, and entire ministries lived in fear of his whispers. But eunuch influence wasn't just political, it was personal. They cared for the emperor from childhood, watched him grow up, and often became father figures, advisors, or sidekicks. Their presence was constant in the emperor's chambers, his study, his courtyards. If the emperor felt lonely, eunuchs usually knew and sometimes exploited that loneliness. However, their lives weren't glamorous. Many were castrated as boys, often from poor families, with hopes of a future inside the palace. Those who survived brutal procedures and years of grunt work could rise through wisdom and luck, but they were always eyed suspiciously by Confucian scholars and military elites, tolerated, exploited, and eventually scapegoated when things went south, often becoming fathers, mentors, or support. Their presence was constant in the emperor's chambers, his office, his courtyard. If the emperor was lonely, the eunuchs usually knew it and sometimes exploited that loneliness. But their lives were anything but glamorous. Many were castrated as young men. These were boys, usually from poor families, hoping to secure a future inside the palace. The survivors of brutal campaigns and years of hard labor could climb the ladder with a mix of smarts and luck. But they were always eyed suspiciously by Confucian scholars and military elites, tolerated, exploited, and eventually scapegoated when things went south. In a city built on ritual and secrecy, eunuchs were the silent hands pulling all the strings, not the emperor, not the soldiers, but something far more complicated and dangerous. Outside the grand halls and towering gates of the Forbidden City lay the most secret area, the inner courtyard. This was the emperor's private world, a maze of palaces, gardens, and bedrooms tucked behind red walls. Here, state affairs gave way to dynasty drama, concubines, wives, and offspring, and here politics was a double-edged sword where beauty, jealousy, and bloodlines ran the show. The inner palace was split into 3 main palaces for the emperor, plus 6 residences for the empress and concubines. But don't be fooled by the peaceful names and fragrant gardens. This was no quiet retreat. It was a battlefield with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of women vying for favor. The inner palace was a world of silent threats, whispered alliances, and cold-blooded ambition. At the top stood the empress, the emperor's official wife. She held status and ceremony, but didn't always get his affection. The emperor's love and air usually came from the concubines, whose status could rise or fall overnight depending on a glance, a pregnancy, or a rumor. Some gave birth to sons and were lifted to power. Others slipped quietly into oblivion, their names forgotten, futures erased without a sound. Palace servants and high officials acted as middlemen, messengers, and sometimes spies. Nothing happened without being noticed. Nothing was forgotten. Women at court had little freedom, but they could influence in subtler ways through charm, manipulation, and occasionally poison. Sometimes a concubine gained enough favor to rule through the emperor. One of the most famous was Empress Dowager Cixi, who rose from a low-ranking concubine to become the real ruler of China for nearly half a century. Her power started right here, behind these walls, behind closed doors, wrapped in silk robes and a sharp mind hiding fierce patience. To outsiders, the courtyard was calm and fragrant, a place of art, music, and refinement. But behind those lattice windows and painted screens was a pressure cooker where status, survival, and lineage clashed. In the Forbidden City, power wasn't just about shoes and robes. Sometimes it tiptoed down moonlit halls in embroidered slippers, flashing a sweet smile before striking inside the city of death. Every gesture meant something every step, every bow, every incense offering. Nothing was done casually. This was more than a palace. It was a divine machine, and the emperor wasn't just a man. He was the son of heaven, the link between earth and the heavens. That meant every move he made carried cosmic weight. It wasn't just about power. It was about order. Every morning, officials lined up at the Meridian Gate long before sunrise, waiting for the morning court. These sessions were short and choreographed to the letter. The ministers knelt, spoke only when asked, and delivered speeches with practiced humility. Outside the palace, they were powerful men. Inside, they were shadows beneath the emperor's feet. One of the biggest ceremonies was the winter solstice, when the emperor offered sacrifices at the temple of heaven to keep the balance between heaven and earth. These rituals weren't optional. They were sacred political theater on a cosmic scale. One botched ceremony, bad weather, or a missed step was seen as a sign that heaven's mandate might be slipping. Inside the palace, rituals controlled every part of life: weddings, funerals, childbirth, even meals. The emperor's food was inspected and tasted by many officials for poison and arranged according to strict tradition. If the emperor changed the menu without permission, chaos could spread through the kitchens and court. But perhaps the most meaningful ritual was silence. You couldn't talk to the emperor unless spoken to. You couldn't look him in the eye. Even his family had to bow, stand, and step back. Distance was mandatory. Intimacy was rare. Over time, this obsession with ritual became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it preserved continuity, structure, and legitimacy for centuries. On one hand, it preserved continuity, structure, and legitimacy over centuries. On the other, it paralyzed decision-making. Ministers bickered over protocol while the outside world changed fast. Foreign powers marched in, revolutions happened, but inside the Forbidden City, officials were still debating the exact number of ritual steps for a royal procession. The very ceremonies that once cemented power began to make it rigid and stuck. They kept the empire running, but trapped it in place, like a beautifully painted clock with hands that stopped moving. Inside those golden walls, the show went on perfect, precise, and increasingly irrelevant. Beneath the lacquered beams and golden tiles of the Forbidden City lies a world unseen in paintings, a world full of shadows, whispers, and endless suspicion. The walls might keep enemies out, but they can't stop ambition inside. And in a palace where power is concentrated, inherited, and usually unstable, the biggest danger isn't the army at the gate. It's the servants in your lord's room. Spying wasn't just common, it was official business. One snitched on another. Palace servants whispered in code. Even the concubines had informants bribing or blackmailing lower servants for dirt on their rivals. The emperor's word was law, but most of the time, he didn't know which word to trust. Paranoia was routine. Letters were opened, conversations were bugged, A careless comment could get you charged with treason. False accusations piled up. Ministers could be heroes one day and exiles the next, just for a whisper. Whole families vanished overnight. Some chose suicide over court trials, knowing what fate awaited them if they resisted. The eunuchs both played and enforced this invisible war, while some were loyal and protective of the emperor. Others built spy networks rivaling secret police under the Ming. The infamous Eastern Intelligence Agency, run like a private company, was handed the terrifying powers, the ability to arrest, interrogate, and execute without civil authorities' approval. Torture was just standard procedure. Confessions were ripped out like teeth, while scholars and court officials grumbled about eunuch influence. They themselves couldn't resist the snooping. The court was like a chessboard, and every promotion, every marriage, every imperial decree was a move in an endless game. Sometimes even the emperor looked ridiculous, especially when young, sickly, or simply bored of ruling. Regents and empress dowagers pulled strings, smiling by day and striking by night. It was a world where success demanded silence, cunning, and perfect memory of loyalty. One misstep, even a careless glance, could be fatal, yet the scheming never stopped, because in the Forbidden City, no reward was greater than being close to the throne, and no fall was more catastrophic than losing it. Beneath the rituals and red walls was a city that never really slept, only watched and waited. The Forbidden City might look eternal, with its golden roofs shining in the sun and red walls untouched by time, but inside, dynasties rose and fell with an alarming frequency. Power seemed godlike from afar, but often deadly up close, and sometimes empires don't fall on battlefields. They crumble down quiet hallways behind locked doors, whispered out of existence by those closest to the throne. The Ming, who built the Forbidden City, ruled for nearly 3 centuries, but by the 1600s, the country staggered under the weight of bureaucracy, internal corruption, and peasant uprisings. The palace had become a maze of obsessive rituals and unified domination, while famine and unrest smoldered outside. In 1644, as rebels closed in on Beijing, the last Ming emperor hanged himself in the imperial gardens. He left a note lamenting his failure and a palace waiting to be taken over. The Manchus, a foreign force from the northeast, swept in and established the Qing dynasty. Notably, they chose to keep the Forbidden City as their power base, blending its old traditions with their own. The architecture stayed, but language, clothing, and rituals changed. Development, once again. The red walls soaked up the shock of change and kept up the illusion of continuity. The Qing dynasty ruled from the Forbidden City for another 268 years, riding waves of insane prosperity and catastrophic collapse. The last Qing emperors, especially in the 19th century, struggled big time to keep up with modern pressures. Western imperialism, internal rebellions, and technological stagnation. Meanwhile, Empress Dowager Cixi ruled from behind the curtain, basically pulling the political strings while flat out refusing reforms that might have saved the empire. When Emperor Puyi took the throne in 1908, the Forbidden City felt more like a museum than a power center. In 1912, the Qing dynasty collapsed, ending over 2 millennia of imperial rule. But weirdly, Puyi was allowed to stay in the Forbidden City for another 13 years, like a ghost haunting the ruins of the past. The emperors were gone, but the city stayed empty, grand, and haunted by echoes of vanished dynasties. The walls were still standing, but the thrones inside were not. After the Qing fell in 1912, the Forbidden City was supposed to fall silent, but instead, it entered one of the strangest chapters in its 500-year history. The monarchy was dead. China was now a republic, but inside those deep red walls, a child emperor lingered. 6-year-old Puyi still wore his dragon robes, still bowed to meaningless rituals, and still ruled absolutely nothing. This bizarre setup was the result of a political compromise. The new Republican government let Puyi stay inside the Forbidden City's inner palace, cut off from the ever-changing streets of Beijing. Outside, warlords fought for power and revolutions reshaped society. Inside, time stood still. Eunuchs kept doing their thing. Meals were served with ceremony. The emperor woke up, dressed, and bowed. A king with no kingdom, a boy living in a shattered dream. But Puyi wasn't clueless. As he grew up, he started questioning the world around him. He secretly read newspapers smuggled into the palace. He saw airplanes flying overhead. Modernity echoed outside his gates while he lived in a fading museum of imperial splendor. And he knew, even if no one said it out loud, that the empire had truly fallen. His isolation sparked resentment, curiosity, and eventually rebellion. In 1923, a massive fire broke out in the palace. A suspicious blaze destroyed precious treasures. Puyi accused the eunuchs of theft and sabotage, and in response, he kicked hundreds of them out. Centuries of palace tradition vanished overnight. The Forbidden City grew eerily quiet. By 1924, a warlord named Feng Yuxiang finally booted Puyi from the palace. The emperor, now a young man, was escorted out through gates once ruled by emperors across generations. He was carted away in a rickshaw. No throne, no honor guard, just a forgotten shadow drowning in memories of lost power. But Puyi's story didn't end there. Later, he teamed up with the Japanese, became a puppet ruler in Manchukuo, and was eventually captured, imprisoned, and re-educated by the communists. In his final years, he worked as a gardener, tending flowers in Beijing, living quietly not far from the palace that once symbolized him. Puyi was the last resident of the Forbidden City, and when he left, he took with him the empire's last breath. Today, the Forbidden City hides no more secrets. It proudly displays them. Once forbidden places in most of China now open their gates to millions. Renamed the Palace Museum, it's not just a monument to imperial grandeur, but a monument to the layers of history, power, an identity that shaped a civilization. Nowadays, walking through its gates, visitors pass towering red walls that once intimidated diplomats and echoed with royal footsteps. The golden roofs still glisten under the sun, and dragon motifs remain as fierce as ever. But now, instead of guards and courtiers, you'll find tour guides, selfie sticks, and students clutching notebooks. The Forbidden City holds, you'd spot tour guides, selfie sticks, and students clutching notebooks. The Forbidden City holds over 1.88 million artifact scrolls, paintings, porcelain, ceremonial robes, weapons, and personal items of emperors and empresses. But beyond all that stuff, what lingers most is the silence of rooms that once decided the fate of millions. Empty thrones, closed doors, and vast courtyards whisper stories louder than any exhibit label. Restoration efforts have kept this complex incredibly intact, yet the Forbidden City remains way better preserved. It's been transformed. Now it's a living museum, a national symbol, and ironically, a place where the memory of a dictatorship is used to educate the public. The irony's thick here. A palace built to exclude has become one of the most visited spots on Earth. But beneath the tourist chatter and camera flashes, the deep weight of this place still lingers. You feel it in the hall of supreme harmony, where emperors once stood high above a kneeling crowd. You feel it in the shady corridors of the courtyards, where whispered words decided fates, and you feel it in the gardens where lonely rulers wandered among stone sculptures, longing for a world they could barely touch. In many ways, the Forbidden City is a mirror of China, its grandeur, control, fragility, and endurance. It's not just a relic of the past, it's the framework to understand how history shapes the present, from isolation to revolution to public memory. This place has seen it all, and still watches on not as a seat of power anymore, but as a witness to everything that happened after the empire's last breath.